In my previous build video, I showed how I'd made some gaming trays for my brother as a birthday present. However, that video showed the highlights, how the process should have gone. There was actually quite a bit of trial and error behind the scenes as I tried to get the process working and learn how to do what I wanted to do. In this video, I'm going to take a look at the first part of the process in a bit more detail and show you some of the things that went wrong and what I learned through the process. Welcome to Laurence Builds. Things started well. Even I can reliably cut rectangles from the end of a plank, but forming the rest of the shape after that was a little more complicated. Now I'd got the rectangles, I needed to cut the corners off to make hexes and then carve out the bowl inside. Let's take a look at cutting the corners off first. It feels like that should be the easier part, and so that's where I started. My intention was to cut them approximately with the miter saw set to 30 degrees off perpendicular, or perhaps 60 degrees, or even 120 degrees depending on how you look at it, and then to accurately make the actual hexagon shape by running a template bit round the edge of a template with my router. That's a great plan, but unfortunately it just pushes the question back a step. How do I make a nice neat hexagon template to cut around? Precise freehand cuts aren't something I feel I could manage with my skill set. Perhaps carefully placing a straight edge and cutting along that, and then moving it 60 degrees to cut the next side, and then the next. Maybe this would be possible if I stuck a piece of paper with a hexagon printed on it onto my template material. Perhaps stick a printed hex onto each wooden rectangle, and then cut very carefully with the miter saw. I didn't feel very happy with any of these ideas. It seemed a bit too reliant on me cutting perfectly and accurately almost 50 times, and I didn't think I was likely to manage that, and that didn't even touch the next step of carving out the insides. Fortunately, it was around this time that my work was giving away an old 3D printer that they no longer needed, and this was perfect for what I needed. With a 3D printer, I could design my template on computer and then print out a version of it that would be solid enough to run a template bit's bearing against. Perfect! I quickly made a hexagon in Inkscape. It turns out it's got a handy tool for drawing arbitrary regular polygons, so this was trivial. I added a circle cut out in the middle for later, and I suppose to save on filament. Then I found a website that could extrude 2D images into 3D shapes, including with height maps, which gave me a couple of interesting ideas for the future, and sent it to the printer. This printer wasn't too bad. I think the printer was able to make it in a couple of hours, probably while I was off at a rehearsal and didn't have to listen to it gently shaking the house for the whole time. I've put rubber matting under the feet, but you can still hear it downstairs. The finished template had a nice flat surface that, with care, I could run the router around on, and this should make it trivial for me to trim the wooden pieces into the perfect hexagons. Ah, hubris. The first stage of the plan was nice and easy though. I placed the freshly printed template on top of each wooden rectangle in turn and drew round it with a pencil. This gave me an idea of where to cut with the miter saw and also ensured I'd be able to easily line the template back up with my original intentions to ensure it fitted nicely onto the block. Now I was ready to start the second stage of cutting. I set the miter saw to 30 degrees according to the gauge drawn on the front of it, not worrying too much about getting the angle precise because I knew I was going to clean it up with the router afterwards. Holding the workpiece securely in place was a bit awkward. There is a clamp built into the miter saw that's designed to hold the wood in place so that it can't move, but it's set quite a long way back from the blade, presumably to ensure that you can't accidentally cut the clamp. However, this means that it couldn't clamp the pre-hexagons, it simply didn't reach. Fortunately, I'd worked out that this was going to be an issue and had done my research. Another YouTube video recommended putting a separate piece of wood of the same thickness on the other side of the clamp, and then using a third piece of wood as a bridge between them. Then when you clamp down on that third piece, it holds the other two steady, and you can start cutting safely. Finding a safe way to hold this down was very important. I'm quite attached to my fingers and would like to stay that way. I'm not a great fan of the design of this clamp though. The red arm is free to slide up and down the black rod at the back, and is only held in place by being pushed up at an angle by the clamp's screw thread. This means you can't just tighten and loosen the screw, you have to make sure it's not slipping as well. But on the other hand, you can adjust the height quite quickly and easily by just running it up and down the rod. It's a nice idea, but the implementation is a little lacking. You can lock it in place with the screw on the side though, and that does help, but it's still a bit fiddly tightening it up and down whenever you need to. Anyway, back onto the subject of cutting the hexes. You can see in these shots that the line from the laser doesn't really line up with the pencil lines I'd drawn, due to my half-hearted angle setting. It also doesn't seem to quite line up with where the blade comes down either though. Once again though, I didn't worry too much about this. These were just supposed to be rough cuts after all. I just made sure that the cut would be fully outside the pencil lines and started chopping. And chopping. And chopping. And chopping. Each hex required 4 cuts, since I was considering the edges that I'd cut earlier to get the rectangles off the board to be a good enough starting point. And 4 cuts isn't too bad. But when you're making 8 hexes, 4 cuts becomes 32 cuts, and when you're also making a couple of test pieces so you can trial things without risking the final workpieces, and when you then have to unclamp and reclamp the workpiece for each one, it ends up taking a while. Still, it works well. You can see a finished one here. The wood is definitely a hex shape and slightly larger than the template, which is what I was aiming for. So far, things are going well. I was happy with the performance of the mitosaur. I had a steadily growing pile of nicely sized and shaped blanks, but this is where things started to get a lot more fiddly. For the sake of the narrative, I'm going to go slightly out of order here, so if you see things in the background that I haven't talked about yet, rest assured that I'll be touching on them soon. The hexes are only cut to roughly the right shape at this point. This is for a few reasons. I don't fully trust how accurately I can set the angle on the mitosaur, and you'll see an excellent example of this later. I don't think the finish from the mitosaur is as good as that from the router, and also the mitosaur has a habit of leaving a curved groove and a scorch mark on the wood after the cut, which I believe is due to the blade rubbing against the same area of wood when I stop moving it and let it slow down. I have to keep it down like this because if you lift the blade back up before stopping it, it can catch on the wood, either damaging it or flinging the offcut off into the distance, or into the operator. Finally, if the template is stuck on top of the workpiece and I run around it with a template bit, I can be absolutely certain that the finished shape matches the template perfectly, eliminating as much measurement error as possible. All of this means that the next step is to use the router and template bit to bring the sides in to make the hexes perfectly match the template. I've talked about them before, but I still think flush trim and template bits are neat. They have a bearing on one end that runs along the template, ensuring that the cutting part of the bit goes exactly where I want it to, following the edge perfectly. The cheap ones I've got do sometimes scrape the template a little, but I've decided that as long as I always use the template the same way up, it doesn't matter if the lower part of it takes a little bit of damage and abuse. It'll still keep the same shape and be consistent for future cuts because the bearing can run along the upper part of it, and as long as the template is made of something the bit can cut, like PLA plastic or MDF or plywood and so on, there's no harm in nibbling out a little bit of it with the router bit. The template needs to be held to the top of the workpiece. However, there shouldn't be any significant forces applied between them. The router slides easily on the top, and the cutting bit just affects the wood. This means that a couple of small pieces of double-sided sticky tape are plenty strong enough to hold the template in place. The tricky part is working out how to hold the whole workpiece down so that I can run the router around the edge of it. The ideal way to do what I'm trying to do here is to use a router table, essentially a table with a router mounted upside down underneath it, with the bit poking upwards through a hole. You can then move the workpiece around on the top of the table, using a holder to keep your hands away from the bit. However, as usual, that's a much bigger tool than I have space for, so I'm having to work with what I've got. I tried using double-sided tape to hold the workpiece on a small pedestal, however, the forces on the workpiece from the cutting bit are strong enough that the workpiece ends up moving and twisting. The tape just can't keep it still. I tried hot glue as well, but again it wasn't strong enough, and it's also difficult to clean the hot glue off the wood. There is a trick I've seen on other YouTube channels where you stick masking tape to both sides and then superglue the two pieces of masking tape together. This might be better, or it might just have the same problem as the double-sided tape. Maybe I'll try that in the future, but I didn't think of it in time for this project. For now, I put the workpiece and template on the edge of the workbench overhanging so that the router bit could cut its full height without going into the bench, and then clamped it in place. This isn't ideal for a couple of reasons. Firstly, the workpiece is only partly overhanging, so I can only get at some of the edge with the router. And secondly, because the clamps are on top of the workpiece, they get in the way of sliding the router around on top of it. From here, I can do maybe 120 degrees of the perimeter before the router hits the clamps, which means I then need to adjust the position of the whole thing twice in order to be able to cut all the way round. Still, it does work, so I made the cuts on the test piece. This went okay. I wobbled the router a bit through carelessness, which put some dents in a couple of the sides, but the basic idea was good. I think part of the problem might have been the table flexing under the weight and force I was putting on it, and eventually I thought of using some spare wood to prop up the table leaf more securely. Once again, I need a proper workshop and a proper workbench. After another quick practice, I tried with one of the dark walnut pieces, which actually went really well. I'm really pleased with how this one turned out. I took the corners very carefully and did a few climb cuts to try to keep them safe. Normally, when cutting with a router, you move the router against the spin of the bit, so the bit is pushing the router backwards or pulling it against the workpiece. A climb cut, on the other hand, is where you move the router with its cutting direction, so the cutting edge is moving in and towards the material you're trying to remove, instead of up and away. This is a bad idea in general because it can lead to the router getting dragged into the cut, it's harder to control, and it can lead to worse tear out, but it can be done if you're careful, and can be worth it if the wood grain is doing something funny. As you can see, this worked nicely and the hex now matches the template. This was a great success. Emboldened by my success here, I moved on to the second walnut hex and started to repeat the process. This should be really easy, I know what I'm doing now. So I ran the router happily along a couple of the sides, rotated it to get to the next bit, and as I got to the corner... Oh, did you hear that? That little snap sound. Yeah, that was the router bit catching in the grain and ripping an entire corner off, as you can see down there. Okay, so what happened here? Why are some of the corners so vulnerable? Well, wood is made up of lots of fibres. These run up the length of the tree for biological reasons, which we won't get into. So when you cut the tree down and make planks out of it, they run down the length of the plank as well. These fibres themselves are quite strong, but the bonds between them are less strong. We call this pattern made by the fibres the grain, and that gives us the nice pattern you can see on wood with different species having different grain patterns. If we take a look at my hex with the ripped off corner, you can see that the grain is running more or less across the corner rather than perpendicular-ish like in some of the other corners. This meant that as the router blade approached the corner and went into some of the fibres, less force was required to tear the wood down the grain and pull the entire corner off than was required to cut through the fibres, and so the wood took the path of least resistance and the corner was torn off. This is the problem with working with a natural material like wood, which isn't just a homogeneous blob of material like plastic or MDF. But on the other hand, that texture is what it makes wood so nice in the finished product. So it's definitely worth it, we just need to think about what we're doing and take steps to mitigate some of the problems we may run into. At this point, I had to stop and do quite a lot of thinking to come up with a way around this. I think it was at least a week, maybe two, before I felt happy with my ideas and started working on the project again. We'll get on to my thought process and solution in the next video though, as this one's already starting to get a bit long, but rest assured I'm not giving up. That video will hopefully be coming out next week, so make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss out on it. There'll also be regular gaming streams on Monday and Wednesday to enjoy, and there's plenty of other videos about my antics on the channel already. My thanks also go to the channel supporters. Without you, I would have a lot fewer tools to work on these projects with. See you next time when, hopefully, I'll get some problems solved. Thanks for watching.